welcome everybody to the second brown bag with the Bertha Centre for Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the GSB. This is our monthly gathering around the topics and research questions and work and knowledge products that keep us awake at night or keep us alive in the day, whichever way you put it or play it. Thank you all for being here with us today and sharing your lunch hour with us, myself, Professor Ralph Hamman, and Intubini and Precious in the background on the call. Ralph has assured me that an introduction is likely less necessary for this gathering, but I will be moderating, and if there are any questions, technical or otherwise, please do drop me a line or just pop it directly into the chat box. And during the Q&A, I will also support just the flagging of questions if that is indeed necessary to get the discussion going and rolling. Thank you so much, Professor Ralph Hamman, with us today. I will hand over to you for the get-go.
Great. Thanks so much, Fergus. So thanks very much to the Bertha Centre for this opportunity and to talk about food system thinking. I think it's particularly useful to do this within and with and through the Bertha Centre, given the wonderful and important work that I think the Bertha Centre does with regard to systems thinking, systems justice, and related systems things. So this is a kind of a recent report that isn't yet published, but is more or less done as far as we're concerned. There might be some tweaks. So this is what I'm hoping to do is to share the basic message and content of that report, and also really to get your feedback, your comments. I mean, there's definitely stuff that we could still tweak on it and work with around it in the way that we use it, perhaps. So I see this as a kind of a working lunch, which is great. I really hope you can chime in, share your impressions, ideas, when, how, why it might be used or not, or used differently to what we have in mind. So please let's make this as interactive as possible. So Fergus, that's what I also was suggesting earlier. If people want to put up their hand, we are not a very big group. I think it's quite useful to have interaction as much as possible. So I did create some slides to really summarize key ideas and also include some images and so on. So I'm going to just play that. Fergus, is it coming across okay?
Yes, affirmative. It's coming through.
Brilliant. Thanks. So this is the guide, and it was mentioned. I think I'm not sure whether everyone on the call has had a chance to look at it. If at all, it was probably distributed quite recently, only before the seminar. So I'm assuming that at most you've had a chance to glance through it, but not really engage with it. And on top of that, what I'd like to talk about is not just the content of the guide, but perhaps a little bit, because this is an audience that is engaged in systems thinking quite intimately, I wanted to explain a little bit more about the underlying rationale, which obviously wasn't elaborated so much in the guide itself, which is quite practice oriented and quite kind of practical, with trying to steer away from theory as much as possible. So the citation is on the top right. The reason I include that is to just mention that Tatiana van Borman and Scott Jimmy have been very involved in that whole process, and so just to say thanks to them as well. Actually, in fact, Tatiana's on the call, so that's great. So one of the co-authors is there. So Tatiana, please chime in if there's stuff I'm missing or that you'd like to add. So the Southern Africa Food Lab I mentioned here is because both Scott and Tatjana and I have been working in the Food Lab for about 12 years now, and quite a bit, I think, of what is in the guide has been shaped or at least inspired in some or other way through these conversations over the years and what we've been doing in the Food Lab. So to give a little bit more, to launch into the rationale, right? So I think I don't have to this audience, I probably don't have to go around into system thinking and definitions and so on, but I think it's pretty clear that this idea of food systems is prevalent. People talk about it all the time, whether you're in the FAO or in universities or in governments, local governments, in fact. It's nevertheless useful to just remind ourselves what a system actually is, because sometimes we use words without reminding ourselves of their meaning. But the system, in this context, very simply is an assemblage of interacting elements that fulfills a function. And that function is important. You know, it could be an ecosystem that supports life, or an air conditioning system that keeps the room cool. But we are obviously concerned with a food system whose primary purpose is to provide adequate nutrition and affordable and all of those other things, appropriate nutrition for all of us, while also maintaining the life support systems of the natural environment in which we depend, and addresses social justice and fairness and those things. And the problem, of course, is that the food system that we have is not succeeding in fulfilling that function. And that's why people are concerned with the food system and have been thinking about ways of thinking about the food system. That is the premise really of our exercise here. So a little bit more in terms of why systems thinking is useful, because it recognizes the interdependence of the various actors, activities, and processes, and ideally also the temporal and spatial scales that are involved in whether or not we have sufficient food on our plates or not. And so the part of that is that if we avoid a systems perspective, there's a chance that very technical or very specific responses will miss the bigger picture and therefore be partial and incomplete or unsuccessful, or even have unintended negative consequences. But it's not just to avoid, incomplete or unsuccessful interventions. Systems thinking can also identify leverage points for effective action. So it's both a kind of an avoidance of negative consequences, but also more proactively oriented towards kind of shaping interventions. The second point is important. For instance, MBA classes, some of you are also teaching this stuff. One of the things when we start talking about systems approaches, quite often I get this feedback from at least some people in the class, which is, oh my God, this is like so overwhelming. We thought it was like, this is the picture. Now the picture is over here. It's so much larger, number one. And it just seems like so many things are interacting. Where do you even start? So they feel quite overwhelmed. But often if we do a kind of a system dynamic or system analytical approach to social problems or business problems, and then it's very important to remind them that, yes, it does provide a lens that broadens our view a lot of the time, and that can be challenging. But at the same time, because of the mapping of interactions between all those elements, it also allows for the identification of leverage points. So now let's focus on food systems, right? So because of all these benefits that I'm mentioning here, there has been a lot of emphasis on food systems, on related guides, on how to think about food systems, and they are very useful. And there was quite a bit of conversation. Tatjana, as I mentioned, who's on the call, and I had quite a bit of back and forth where, I was thinking, well, there's already these fantastic guides out there and tools and reports. Why do we need something else on top of all that? And so I think my suggestion that I got to was that these guides are useful, but they have two important limitations. And to some extent, these limitations apply to the way that we use systems thinking generally, not just in food context, but in whether it's urban development or energy or other sectors. So the first one is that these, and I'm focusing here on the FAO guidance for a moment, just as an illustration. They were to really do what they are suggesting you should do. It is very intensive in terms of time, effort, and resources. I'm just going to give you an example here of one city where this systems thinking or systems analysis approach that the FAO colleagues have recommended, right? So they implemented it in Toronto and Colombo and other places. But if you look at the synthesis report of the Toronto process, it's a 100-page report, and each subsection has like its own set of reports that it points you to, and it's a multi-year process of stakeholder dialogues, of surveys, of interviews. It's actually an amazing commitment, and I take my hats off to the people in Toronto, and the university played a role, and the municipality was really involved. But this is a big commitment. There's quite a bit of resources that was put into this, and a lot of time. So what I'm saying is, well, surely there's a way to also develop a way of food system thinking that is quick and accessible. And what I mean by quick is it doesn't need 3 years or more. It's something that you could do even by yourself or in a group within a workshop that's just a couple of hours or something like that. And it's accessible in the sense that you don't need lots of cash and people and data. And it's nevertheless practically useful. So that was the first motivation for us to kind of think about, okay, let's think about an additional way to apply systems thinking in food context. The second concern that I want to put on the table with these existing approaches is they prioritize, and this is a quote from one of them, a holistic food system assessment. So basically they say, because all these things in this food system are interconnected, we need to map them all out, ideally on one kind of depiction of the system. And here's an example from a generic point of view of how to map food systems. This is one of just about 10 to 20 examples that you can easily find online. This is one of the most famous ones by the high-level panel of experts linked to the FAO. And I think it's a great model. It's obviously pretty abstract, right? So what this looks like at a local level or in different kinds of national or regional context is of course a separate issue. But already here you see, like, oh my gosh, like the things we need to take into account, ranging from the ecological to the political to the cultural and religious, and going from the supply chains and production all the way to the processing, packaging, retail, and marketing to consumer behavior. It's pretty overwhelming, even at this generic level. It becomes even more challenging if we then take the next step, which is to say, well, if you are going to actually do a specific system analytical process, one of the ways that many of you on the call will know that people do this is through causal loop diagrams, right? So here's an example, and actually this is one of the more elegant causal loop diagrams of a local food system that I've come across. It's in a I think it was a PLOS One journal that published this particular article of a local community nutrition system. And one of the I like these, right? I think in my MBA classes and other classes we try our hand at these kinds of things. But even so, or especially because of the experience, I have come across two important limitations of CLDs. The first one is that, especially for practitioners, right? You come to a manager in a company or an NGO or municipality, and you say, let's do this causal loop diagram mapping, and here's the outcome after a day or two of work. it basically ends up being spaghetti soup. It's, a picture like this is just very overwhelming. Where do you even, where's the entry point into understanding what actually matters in these many, many elements and these complex, multi-layered relationships and interdependencies and kind of restricting cycles and so positive or negative feedback loops and all of that stuff. It's practitioners that haven't really had a lot of chance to look into the kind of knowledge base of systems thinking. They get very easily overwhelmed, and I don't blame them at all. The second thing is that despite the complexity, it's not quite complex enough, because a causal loop diagram really struggles to consider and communicate spatial and temporal scales. Right? So some of the errors in this causal loop diagram might represent effects that take place within meters in space and within minutes or hours in time, right? Whereas other errors in this picture might cut across 100 or 1,000 kilometers, and they might cut across not days, but months or years. So, with that, the picture does not grapple with spatial and temporal scales, which is why I think that even though causal loop diagrams are useful for a particular kind of purpose, they have these quite important shortcomings. And the way to summarize it is that paradoxically, these predominant approaches to systems thinking are simultaneously too complicated and too simple, which is giving us the incentive to do something, try something different. So this is our experiment here, right? So I think it's an attempt to try a different cognitive or intellectual approach to systems, and keen to hear what you guys think. So the first aspect of the basic idea is, instead of focusing on this large system at the same time and try to map everything and all of it in one picture, we zoom in on a specific crucial point where the system failure is essentially is most directly visible. And especially in the food system, I don't think that's that difficult to identify. It's when a child, and commonly it's a child in communities that are low income and precarious, right? Those children, there's an inordinate amount of children, especially in South African context, that are at risk of hunger or malnutrition. And there is an ethical principle here. So John Rawls and others have written about this fairness principle, which emphasizes that any intervention should prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable members of a community or a society. Secondly, in the nutrition literature and food security literature, there is also an increasingly prominent child-centered approach to food systems. There are very good practical reasons for that, because child malnutrition leads to long-term negative effects for the affected individual, but it also has long-term effects, including economic effects on his communities and society. I'm saying that even though I'm guessing that for many of you in the room, this is not controversial or perhaps even totally obvious or intuitive. Even so, it's interesting, some colleagues in other WWF offices have pushed back on this and said, well, for various reasons, we think that we should have a family-focused approach. And so, it's interesting that even though some of this might seem fairly intuitive, there are some, kind of pushback that we're kind of also grappling with and still discussing. So it's not, these decisions we've made in this guidance are not entirely uncontroversial. The second thing, once we've zoomed into this particular point, is to then say, okay, from here we can zoom out into successive layers of the social ecological system surrounding this kind of emblematic child, in order to then increase the spatial temporal scales of analysis. right? And so that's why we call it the onion model, because literally it's like an onion with the various models that kind of layer upon the focal interest here on child nutrition. And so this is what it looks like in the guide, at least the current version. Is it's a process, a thinking process, a conversation guide, facilitation guide, whatever you want to use it for. But essentially, it suggests 13 steps. And the first we already spoke about, it's to really recognize the benefits of food system thinking. The second step we also have started to consider already, which is, recognize that there's already some very valuable guidance out there, and you need to be aware of that. In other words, we don't want to pretend that this guide is the be-all and end-all, and anyone considering this particular guide should also be aware of the other reports out there, including the strengths and possible constraints. So we've already spoken about the third step, which is about focusing on the needs of the child, and it is a kind of a symbolic center of the system, a center of the onion here, right, from which we want to then expand our analysis. And then it's basically the onion, right? It's the, what is this, 4 to 11, that's like 8 steps, 8 layers to the onion, which are, this is not the only way to draw this picture. Of course, we could have perhaps identified other layers, but we're moving successively beyond the focal child to understand what is influencing this child's nutrition or access to nutritious food. And I think I'll go through some of those layers in a moment. I'm just checking if there are any questions or comments. Please do say if there's any concerns. Here, the first step is to recognize the links to household income, because clearly, if households are too impoverished to spend on food, that puts them in a very vulnerable position. And so, as a practitioner, there should be a real emphasis on recognizing, for instance, the distribution of formal employment in communities. So, in other words, those communities where there's very little formal employment or access to formal employment, clearly those communities are particularly at risk. But obviously, there's also a very important role for informal work, and quite a lot of the guide is trying to emphasize that practitioners must pay much more careful attention to the informal sector. And in this case, it's with regard to accessing income earning opportunities. So for a start, if you are a practitioner in a municipality, important guidance that is in the report is to not disadvantage informal work, as much as often is the case in many, let's say, South African cities. The other source of income, of course, especially in places like South Africa, is social grants, and public services play an important role in buttressing that source of income as well, because of the interrelated nature of social grants and things like electricity and water and so on. The second, so the next step is, yes, it's true that we need to consider household income, but we also need to consider the internal household dynamics that influence how that income is spent, what shapes consumption, and access to services. So the first point that's very important here, and I don't think it'll come to as much of a surprise, is gender dynamics are really important. There's quite a lot of research that shows that women empowerment is a very strong indicator of sufficient food being available in a household for the children in those households. The second point here is that there's also a lot of research that shows how unhealthy food is both cheaper and more accessible in communities that are precarious for various reasons. Some of them are mentioned in the guide. So that is something that practitioners can also proactively try to tackle. And then clearly, essential services play an important role. So if you don't have a fridge, you can't keep things fresh, and things like that. And so what that means is that if you're a practitioner, whether it's in the private sector or the public sector, you probably this is the kind of realization or recognition that will shape practices. For example, I think it's an important reason to avoid cutoffs of things like electricity, which have become a kind of fairly standard way to force payment. So I mean, it's a very complicated issue, but once we recognize that this isn't just about, you'll only get a service if you pay for it. This is also about the human rights linked to food security and nutrition. It really raises the stakes of how we consider essential services to communities. Next layer, the third layer of the onion is map food. The recommendation is to map food distribution and retail. There's the local area in which household exists is shaped by the availability of food in various kinds of distribution and retail arrangements. So for a start, practitioners need to look at fair competition, including possible dominance by large retailers that come into a community and then displace smaller retailers. I think what's interesting, for instance, in the South African situation is that the Competition Commission has started playing a more active role in monitoring prices, and that's a very positive development, especially clearly that was one of the implications of the pandemic, right, the COVID crisis, that the Competition Commission became more actively involved. And that's something where practitioners should really encourage that to continue. Linked to that is food safety rules that need to be monitored, and sometimes some people see the tension between food safety and the informal sector. I don't think that's necessarily the case, that informal sector food retail is less safe, but it does mean that food safety rules should not shy away from the informal sector. Again, this point about informal retail, instead of harassing informal retail and traders, I think practitioners need to play a much more active role in supporting and working with informal retail actors. Finally, in this issue, I think I wanted to mention the role of crime. For instance, when we did some research in Delft, it was very intriguing to me how the spaza shops were impacted by crime and gangs. And not only the retailers, also the distributors of food are really curtailed in what they can and can't do because of crime in places like that. All right, so there's a question. Fergus, shall I open it up and see?
Yes, and the reason I might have prompted that one is because Anila's question had to do with earlier on, how does one arrive at that specific location where the failure of the system is most problematic? So obviously the case of the needs of children, and perhaps that might just help clarifying how we walk through the steps.
Okay, so Jane, let me just address your question very quickly. I'm getting to that exact point in a moment. So if you still have that question in 5 minutes time, let me know. So Anila, well, the location. When I say location, I'm just to clarify. It's not. This is not necessarily a geographic location. It's a symbolic location within the system. So that child represents a focus for our system analysis. That could translate into particular geographic focal analysis, right? So you could say, depending on how you want to apply this, right? You could say, I'm going to apply this to Khayelitsha. And then within Khayelitsha, you can use this kind of onion model to say, okay, within Kaalicha, there are some areas that are much more vulnerable than others, and then within that, and within those areas, there are, in terms of this theme that we're talking about right now, the food distribution and retail is characterized by A, B, and C, right? And so, because even at the scale of something like Kaalicha, you have quite significant differences in terms of access to formal retail and informal retail. And Jane knows a lot more about that because she's actually mapped retailers in Cape Town to quite a significant extent. Now, or you could be doing this at the level of the city as a whole, right? And there you can then also, you would do a similar thing where you could say, well, in Constantia or in Bishop's Court or Sea Point, perhaps it's not, there aren't such big concerns, although in a place like Sea Point, especially, you might then say, well, there's a community of people that are without shelter. There actually is a real food security concern that we haven't really been thinking about all that much. So that's what I mean by location. And it's both a symbolic sense of where to focus in terms of what themes, but it's also then something that you can take into a specific geographic analysis. I don't know whether that answers your question, but let me know if it doesn't. So let me then continue, and please, kind of maybe repeat the question or revise the question if I didn't understand it correctly. I want to quickly go through the layers, and then I think I'll be done in providing an overview in probably 10 minutes, and then we have 15 minutes or so where we can perhaps have an more open conversation. So Fergus, if that's okay with you, it'd be great to also see some of the others and let them make some questions or comments. So the next two layers are really around firstly, households' own production of food and direct access. And so a key point in this is that in the last two slides, I've really been focusing on market-based distribution, retail, and access to food. And so I mentioned things like income, distribution of income, use of expenditures, consumption choices, and so on. Now, with this layer, what we're trying to point to is that parallel to a market-based distribution system, we have what we might call a solidarity-based food economy, where households grow their own food. Often they would be sharing of that food, or donation of that food, or bartering of that food. So the cash economy doesn't necessarily dominate that. I mean, I think it still plays a very important role, but it's in some ways there's a parallel functioning going on. And so as a part of what the guide is trying to do is to foreground that this is not just, the food system is not just the market-based food system of food economy. And I think that's hopefully going to be useful, because quite a few reports or studies out there, I think, make the mistake of focusing only really on the market. And that's also visible in some of these large food system analyses. So for instance, the higher level panel seems to also largely focus on food as a commodity, right? And even though there is a call to go beyond seeing food only as a commodity, but as a human right. Now, what this means is, for a practitioner, you wanna understand, but then also support things like household food production, and there's various ways that can be done. We mentioned in the guide some advice from Erica Inches, who's done a lot of work with community gardens and gardening schemes, distributing of seeds in an appropriate way. There's these wicker-based food boxes that can be used. So that's one element. Another element is clearly the fostering of food gardens in schools or other spaces, including vertical food gardens up walls and so on. And then, Jane, you mentioned the point about ECDs. So the school feeding schemes, especially in South Africa, I think everyone realized just how important they were and underappreciated when they stopped, right? They stopped, especially outside the Western Cape. They stopped for quite a few weeks or even months during the lockdowns. And that had a really severe impact on low-income communities, especially. And so part of what the guide is trying to do is to foreground the importance of these school feeding schemes, as well as the possible role of ECDs. And that's something that I haven't seen, I think, enough of, is an analysis of that role of ECDs, because as we know, there's this very large diversity of early childhood development pressures and so on. I mean, some of them are basically a shack, and they don't have any support from the state or hardly anyone else. And others, of course, then are on that progression towards full subsidies from the state. Now, depending on where you are on that spectrum, will influence whether or not you can provide valuable food to the kids in those ECDs. But Jane, if you have more insight on that, I'd love to hear that. In fact, maybe I should just pause for a moment to see if you do want to chime in on that. I don't want to put you in the spot, but we can also just continue and then you can come in. Okay, the last point here is around another insight that I think we gained from the pandemic, which is the remarkably important role of community kitchens, civil society organizations, the food banks, and intermediaries that play this kind of role of bundling resources, whether it's from state or civil society sources, and making them available to community kitchens or other direct providers of food relief. And so one of the, we did quite a bit of work on that during the pandemic. Then there was an article we published with some of the people linked to the Bertha Centre, right? So Jenny, I think, is doing the MPhil, and a couple of others are also bursary holders through the Bertha Centre in the MPhil. So those are two layers. I'm going to quickly move on to another one, which is around food waste and making food systems more circular. This is an image from the European Commission, and I think it's quite useful in just mapping out the basic idea. And I think part of that is already being implemented in quite a few South African communities, and actually quite a lot of the CANs, the community action networks, are themselves contributing, number one, to more local food supply chains, and number two, to the circularity of those, right? So they're using food that is grown in the community gardens, in the community kitchens, using the waste that's coming from those kitchens as sources for compost that then goes back into those community kitchens, right? So that is already, I think, a powerful illustration of making supply chains, number one, more local, and number two, more circular. So, Fergus, have you seen Jane's point about the mic? Maybe
yes, I have.
Open it up.
Yeah, we've provided her with talking rights. She should be able to unmute now. Jane, are you with us?
You want to speak to her?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there is just massive potential in the ECDs. And I know that at the moment in the Breda Valley, there's some interesting conversations about how to crowd nutrition into those environments. Some about gardens, some beyond that, thinking about sort of registration issues and other modes of kind of bringing more nutritious food in. I think if Scott's on the call, he's also more qualified than me to talk on that. But I think it is an important element.
Yeah, so Scott isn't, but I'm really glad to hear that there's dedicated attention to this, because when I was doing a bit of the research around this, I mean, clearly, and because the guide, by the way, is not just for a South African audience, it's, Tatiana can speak more to this, but it's being published as a guide that's also received inputs from the US offices and the Swedish and so on. So even though it's published by WWF South Africa, we always had to be quite explicit about kind of an international audience. So when I did a bit of the research, there is international research on the importance of school feeding schemes, as you know, probably, Jane, but there's I was quite surprised how little attention there is to the kind of feeding initiatives within the ECD space. So, I mean, the fact that you guys are exploring this in the Breeder River area, you know, I think there's a lot of scope to communicate that also to a broader audience. Cool. So let me finish off with an overview. The next level. I mean, you can see, right, how we are zooming out to more successively broader levels, and this has implications for, you know, as a practitioner, some people will feel a lot more at home, so to speak, at the kind of more local scale of what's going on in households, in the ECDs, or the local distribution of food in a community, whether it's in Delft or Philippi or whatever. Whereas other practitioners on different parts of a municipal bureaucracy, for example, that are more strategic, or that are saying, well, they might actually have some influence on, for instance, infrastructure, right? So local, I mean, one of the examples I think also mentioned in the report is that I think South African food has become more expensive because of demise of the South African rail network. As an example of just how important infrastructure is in ensuring you know, nutritious and affordable food. Now, clearly, if you are a municipal official somewhere in Cape Town or elsewhere, you don't have a lot of influence about a national rail network, but you do have influence, for instance, on the infrastructure that is supportive of things like the fresh produce market, you know, in Epping, or you know, other kind of markets like that in Philippi, and that infrastructure plays a really important role in keeping food fresh and enabling the kind of effective exchange of food along the supply chain. The other point we are making, though, is that a lot of practitioners and guides, for that matter, they might mention infrastructure, but we are trying to really foreground also what we call ecological infrastructure, or actually it's Sandy that calls it that. Other people have different names for it, but we need to recognize that it's not just the kind of tar and asphalt and cranes in the harbors that matter, but also things like wetlands that play a really important role in keeping our water clean, and do so often more effectively or cheaper than kind of artificial installations, especially if they're not well maintained. So the point here is to really raise awareness amongst practitioners about both kind of the hard physical infrastructure, but also the ecological infrastructure in cities. I mean, for instance, in flooding, this is a very well understood principle these days, especially now also in China with these sponge cities that they are trying to foster. Now, finally, I want to quickly go through this now. There's also stuff that practitioners might want to do in terms of shaping consumption choices, not specifically in vulnerable households, but actually at the broader consumer market level. Right, and so here's an example on the right here of a guide that was prepared by Melbourne city officials, which really tried to encourage people to do these things. On the left-hand side there, buy local, buy plant-based, avoid packaging, and so on. Sorry, that last bullet point is a mistake. It doesn't need to be there. But I think that's an interesting example here in Melbourne of how practitioners at a local municipal level were trying to get involved in actually purchasing and consumer preferences and behaviors in that particular part of the world. So the last two steps are then to pull things together, right? And I'm going to quickly go through that, and then we still have a couple of minutes for any comments and feedback or questions. So the first step that pulls things together is to integrate these various understandings of the various layers of the food system into a coherent and participatory urban governance process on food. So the first, depending on where we are, then you might want to, for example, create a working group. And that is exactly what's been happening in the Western Cape provincial government. And again, Jane and others can speak more to this. You know, the Western Cape has this household food and nutrition security strategic framework, which has become, I think, a very important initiative within the provincial government. They have this working group that cuts across different parts of the government, and that's a really good example of trying to create more coherence and integration across governance systems. I mean, they still have a long way to go, but it's like it's the first step, right? The other example I wanted to mention here in the South African context is the Economic Development Partnership for the Western Cape, which is a kind of intermediate organization that has established this thing called a Western Cape Food Forum. And this is a mapping at the bottom. In fact, Jenny, who is in the MPhil for Inclusive Innovation, she was involved in creating that little picture there of the various stakeholders involved in the food forum and beyond. And these are really important, I think, early day initiatives to create more coherent urban governance around food. Now, if you were to take that further, we might go the route of Toronto. If you look at, I mentioned Toronto at the beginning of the talk, an incredibly comprehensive and quite intensive process linking research and practitioners in government and other stakeholder groups in creating a very good analysis of the system in order to then identify a vision and a strategy for moving forward. That might be, I mean, ideally, that would be what I think should go for in Cape Town as well. Very finally here, there is then a kind of set of guidance about, well, how do we prioritize the issues that we should give attention to? And that basically involves an analysis of who's doing what, and maybe where are the gaps in what is being done, and what are the interventions with which we can kind of address more than just one specific issue, but actually have more of a larger effect in the system, this idea of leverage points, right? And I think the circular supply chains do play that kind of role as an example. There might be others as well. To conclude, we're basically introducing this idea of an onion model of system thinking. One of the things that I'm interested in perhaps hearing is whether people think that could be applicable in other kinds of systems, for example, in energy, or I see Josephine was on the call, she's an expert in systems analysis in energy systems. I think yes, but I haven't really had a chance to really think through that. And then more specifically, it's a set of issues and layers that are proposed as a way to think through food system issues, especially in urban context, that are applicable in diverse parts of the world. And it'd be interesting to see how it might be picked up in different parts of the world. Good, Fergus, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Ralph. There aren't any immediate questions forthcoming. Like I've said in the chat, if you'd like to join the conversation via voice, then just pop your hand up and we'll unmute you promptly. But in the meantime, I actually wanted to throw something onto the table myself, Ralph, if I may. And so first of all, sort of recognizing that I'd almost like to know whether there has been any initial commentary from scholars in the systems thinking space on this model, particularly recognizing that in a way it sort of challenges traditional systems thinking models and frameworks in a neat way. And then on that specific point, one could say that the pain point or the area of most problematization, which, as you say, relates directly to geographies, which is the spatial part of the systems map framework that often isn't there. What would you say to a systems thinking scholar or practitioner who might challenge the framework and say, well, instead of seeing that as a leverage point, what you're doing is, I almost want to say, moving to the most immediate concern at the risk of possibly overlooking the power dynamics and sort of systemic issues that perpetuate those problems. So I'm just wondering if there's been any commentary from system scholars who have that kind of criticism yet.
Okay, so the short answer to that is no, but there's a good reason for that, which is this is like super in nascent. I mean, hot off the press. I mean, it's not even in the press. I mean, I think WWF is going to sit on it for a couple of weeks. Tatiana can tell us the details of that. They're still going through some internal reviews. Who knows? It might actually never be published because maybe they I don't know. There's something that goes on there. Tatiana, you can let us know an update. But so the point is, it's pretty new ideas that I'm sharing here as a way of going about it. I mean, I'm the second aspect to that is that I'm not sure whether and how to try to publish something in the academic literature. So this is a practitioner guide, that the WWF will publish. It's not targeted at academics, and I have been playing with the idea of doing that though, to write something, and I'm playing with some ideas of what kind of journal. Maybe Josephine or Jane have some ideas. I mean, I do have a kind of a link to a journal called Environment, and they said that they would be happy to, but it's a little bit of an inside job because I'm also one of the editors. Anyway, I mean, Fergus, thank you for the question, because I'm still thinking about whether and how to maybe translate some of this for an academic argument. I mean, obviously that would focus very much on the first few slides that I focused on, 45 minutes ago. The second point you raise is also interesting and I think important. I mean, the focus on the child at risk is not a leverage point. That is a heuristic. It's a way to focus attention on one part of the system that we think is particularly important, and then in order to have a spatially and temporally conscious way of expanding to successive layers. Now, related to that, you raised the concern that perhaps this is agnostic to power and inequality and so on. I mean, I think inequality is, to some extent, it's baked into this approach because we are, from the get-go, we are focusing on those that are most vulnerable and at risk. And so I think that, in some ways, that is shaped, that is informed by an approach that is sensitive to inequality and injustice and power. But I think your point is nevertheless valuable because in fact, I thought about this morning, whether some of the layers should pay more explicit attention to power. I mean, some places we do that. So, for instance, there are these mentions of the possible role of anti-competitive practices by large retailers, right? That is clearly an issue of power and economic power. There might be other places where that needs to be foregrounded more. So, Fergus, I agree. It's something that may deserve more attention.
Thank you very much. And we have a question from Anik here in the chat box. So the question is it possible to link food gardens with ECD and soup kitchens? I'm involved with market access locally in urban Cape Town, and it would be good to engage with local government. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is absolutely yes, and it's happening quite a lot. So if we look at some of the work being done by some of the community action networks that emerged in the crisis, in the lockdown crisis of 2020, quite a few of them are doing exactly this, what you are referring to. I mean, the focus on ECDs hasn't been that explicit, and I think maybe this is something that could become more foregrounded, perhaps. But the stronger link is what you refer to, the link between the community gardens and the community kitchens. So in Guguletu, people like Pamela Sarana and so on, they are really working on this directly to make sure that the community kitchens, they don't rely on necessarily buying all of their produce from the retailers or from donations, but that they can actually source some of that from the community gardens. And as I said, create these circular processes where some of the waste then goes into compost and so on. I mean, Fergus, you've done quite a bit of work with some of the cans. I don't know whether you've seen that in some of your areas that you've been working on, in Muizenberg, for example. But that, I think the short answer, Anik, is definitely yes. And local government, I think, should be supporting that kind of thing. I mean, if you are interested in that, you should also join. I don't know if you've joined the regular sessions of the EDP Food Forum, Western Cape Food Forum. They have now rebranded themselves under the slogan, what is it, Jane? Is it local food and local supply chains or something? I forget the actual slogan now, but it's basically exactly what you're referring to, Anik, is what they are trying to foster. So, if you want to send an email to Jenny, who is one of our students working with the Food Forum, or to Andrew Bahrain, who is the coordinator of that, I think that would be a useful place for you to also make those connections to local government, people who are also in that forum.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So that was me being answered. Yes, sorry, the audio is coming through quite a little bit distorted, but that's good news. And so I'll definitely take you up and follow up on that email. Also looking at like providing local markets. So a lot of these farms were providing market boxes, which were sold in Constantia and CBD and whatever. And it would be good to look at how to improve it sort of within local communities and how to engage that more, even clinics, hospitals, all that kind of thing. So, yes, thank you. I'll follow up on that. It's good to hear. Yeah. Appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, Jane, I wonder if we could just loop you into this, because you've done quite a bit of this underground research use. But because on the one hand, there have been, I mean, we used to get this box, the ethical co-op, for instance, but and some of those initiatives were doing okay for a while, and then quite a few of them actually have floundered, right? So it's not like this is a new idea. It's been around for quite a while, but clearly they do struggle, basically because they are competing with, Pick and Pay and Shake Lickers and the established retailers and so on. I don't know whether we will see any resurgence in that. I mean, what do you think, Jen?
Gosh, Ralph, throw me under a bus.
I'm sorry, can I just say something quickly? I don't mean to interrupt, Jane. I was from the ethical co-op, just by the way. So I'm now looking at it in a different light. So yeah, I'm sorry, Jane, to interrupt.
Yeah, no, I was going to say Anik really is the kind of expert in this area. I mean, it's interesting. Abalimi have shifted their model away from the box schemes, going into the elite areas, trying to go into local markets, and there does seem to be a lot more energy around that. But yeah, I mean, the sustainability of that model is still to be tested. Yeah, I think that the terrain is shifting very fast, and the economics are shifting so fast. I think we're struggling to keep up with what's going on.
So the other person, especially in the Bertha kind of network, Ashley Newell, some of you might know her. She started this thing called Food Flow during the pandemic, right? And it was quite interesting following the progression of that initiative, because clearly that model relied on donations, which were forthcoming during the crisis, the first 2-3 months, but then diminished radically, which meant that Food Flow had to search for a different business model. And discussing this with Ashley over the months that of the latter parts of 2020 and so on, what was really interesting is that she did quite a bit of market research, and one of the things she was struck by just how amazingly low the margins are in those distribution networks. It's incredibly difficult to develop a business model that actually keeps the enterprise going. So it's something that I think maybe also the social innovation business model types in the Bertha Centre could at some point give some attention to. I mean, it's a tricky space though.
There's also saying earlier that they're competing against the likes of the Pick and Pays and the Checks and the ShopRites. But as you say, it's not just the competition per se, but the incredible costs of getting an operation like that to a scale that makes sense and can withstand shock, whether it's in sort of a more regular shock like the pandemic, or intermediate market shortages, or increased supply in specific products. And so in order to run a business that is resilient in that kind of market, I would think is really difficult. And hats off to anybody who's trying to break into it. And then also, just to second your suggestion, that indeed it seems like a critical kind of question to either prompt or suggest that scholarship, particularly in the Bertha Scholar community, for example, could spend some more time on, given that it's very much a practitioner and theory-based endeavor. So yeah, taken.
I mean, we probably run out of time, Fergus, and you need to advise us on that. But I mean, one of the things, I don't know how well colleagues in the Bertha Centre know about Jane and her group at UCT in the geography department, right? So we've heard from Jane once or twice today, and I think the Bertha colleagues and the GSB colleagues should really have a look at that. One of the things that Jane has looked at is the impact of the spread of supermarkets, which is obviously not just a South African phenomenon. It's a much broader one, international one. And on the one hand, you might say, well, if you're in a community that has little access to food, then if a supermarket opens up down the road, that would be a good thing, right? But on the other hand, I think Jane's work and others is suggesting that it's not necessarily always such a good thing. And so that's also one of the, I think it would be quite useful to strengthen some of the links across at UCT, and of course then there's some people at Stellenbosch University doing interesting work, but even just to be aware of important food system work in other parts of the university would be useful.
Thank you for that prompt. I think myself and Kense particularly will likely look into that as soon as we can, definitely, and we'll reach out to you, Jenny.
Cool. I mean, Anik, you asked about contact. Please just feel free to email me if there's any, then I can send direct any responses, for example, contacts that I might have mentioned. So I'm just going to put my email address quickly into the chat. And then also, if you have...
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, those of you that have not received the guide and want to have a look at it, just email me and I'll send it to you.
I know that we send out a post brown bag sort of email with the link to the recording, but also perhaps we can just make sure to add links to what you've just referred to, Ralph, in that mail, so that you all receive it in one place. Are there questions or contributions or a closing remark, perhaps a provocation to close us off? Nothing yet on my side.
Well, Fergus, I'll just say thank you very much. I think it's been great. I love the fact that you're doing these brown bags, and look forward to your next iteration.
Absolutely, and likewise, I look forward to when time expands, whenever that is, to dig a little bit deeper into the resource and to explore it. It obviously fascinates us because we are constantly peddling systems approaches to dealing with really difficult justice issues, and this one definitely challenges a possibility, I think, in systems practice to, as you pointed out, to both oversimplify and overcomplicate. And to get around that dance is something that I think at the Bertha Centre we're often very cognizant of as we bridge the scholarly and practice-oriented world. So just from us, a big hearty thank you for this contribution towards the Brown Bag series. And thank you to everybody on the call participating so brightly. May you have a fabulous Friday afternoon. Thanks all.